Welcome back, my friends. Hey, I'm really excited for this episode. And I know I say that a lot, but this is one that I think you're going to get a lot of insights about or insights from. Ken Albala is a fascinating human being who has written more books than I could count and even more articles. He is by far the most published individual that we have had on the podcast. Now, I got introduced to Ken through Food, a Cultural Culinary History, which is one of the great courses series on Audible. It's an 18-hour and 22-minute series on the great courses on Audible that I'm going to be honest with you, I've listened to about 3 or 4 times. So that tells you how much of a nerd I am when it comes to food, nutrition, and all things of the like. Uh, you're going to be blown away. I hate to spoil it for you, but there is no such thing as a paleo diet. Like, I know there is because somebody created it and told you that that's what Paleolithic people ate. Ken is the premier, the foremost researcher in food and culture and what people ate when. Why did they eat it? And I'm going to burst your bubble here during this episode, or I guess Ken is, that much of what you think you know about the history of food, much of what you think you know about what you're eating today, and much of what you want to believe because you're either of the Church of Keto, the Church of Carnivore, the Church of Clean, the Church of whatever your nutrition religion is, Ken is going to blast it and blow it away because he's going to walk through what the real history is. There's not a better researcher on the planet right now. There is not a more prolific writer on the planet to look to when it comes to what the history of food, culture, and how and why we eat what we do is. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to Ken Albala.
Welcome to the Evolved Man, where we are at war with the mediocrity of modern man. The Evolved Man is for men like you who are willing to be strong, open, and aggressive learners. Men who are not afraid to disrupt and change. It's time we ditch the current conventional idea that we devolve with age, that the dad bod is our destiny, and that the glory days are behind us. Your best isn't behind you, and I'm here to provide you with practical tools, a few tips and tricks, and everyday wisdom to help you evolve into your highest form. Strong, lean, smart, educated, and emotionally intelligent. Now, let's go to war.
Well, Professor, firstly, thank you for coming on. As somebody whose CV fits on a napkin, it's an honor to have someone with a 14-page curriculum vitae. Wow.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
So I first got introduced to your work through Food, a Culinary Cultural History on Audible, which I believe at this point I've listened to 3 or 4 times. Uh, I, so I'm curious, what was it that originally got you interested in studying food and culture and history?
It's actually very simple. I was studying Renaissance cultural history at Columbia University, and I needed a dissertation topic. I really had no idea what I wanted to do in particular, and my advisor gave me some advice to go across the park, Central Park, to the New York Academy of Medicine. And I, of course, raised my eyebrows, thinking I have no interest in medicine. I've never said anything about that before. What could you be thinking of? And he's explained that they have very comfortable chairs, and
Oh, interesting. Okay.
he wasn't kidding. He was actually in earnest. He said it's a very good library, and they will treat you well, and there won't be anyone else there, and it's beautiful. They had tons of money in the 20s, so built this lavish reading room for rare books. And
Mm,
I literally just walked in there. This is in the days before computer catalogs, so it was a filing cabinet, with a card catalog.
right, right.
And
Dewey
I
Decimal.
just happened to, yeah, I just happened to pull one out that was a record of the collection of Margaret Barclay Wilson, who was a nurse in the 1920s, apparently well endowed, I mean, monetarily. And she collected pretty much every book on dietary medicine that she could get her hands on um,
Interesting.
at the time, which included 15th to like 17th century texts. And I thumbed through it for a minute and I said, that's a good dissertation topic. Okay, I'll do that. So I was really, I made a couple of trips, but I would say 90% of all the work I did in that room. And basically just sat there for 3 years and started reading everything in about,
Wow.
I don't know, half a dozen languages. But it was really kind of enthralling material. And eventually did become my dissertation and became my first book, Eating Right in the Renaissance. But it was really chance. I could have ended up in anything, and I happen to love food and I love cooking. So it seemed to make a lot of sense. And from there, I just kind of wandered away from the history of nutrition and far more into the history of cooking and food in general.
That's fascinating. Morgan Housel just came out with a book recently that he talks about how many of the pivotal moments in history happen because of chance, because the wind blew one way versus the other. And
Absolutely right.
isn't that the case in our lives? Okay, so food, how we eat, what we eat, why we eat, it's fascinating from prehistoric days to ancient Judea to early Christian, all the way to modern times. But isn't food just food? I mean, haven't we always eaten the same things?
Well, we haven't eaten even vaguely the same things over time. Obviously, the cooking methods changed dramatically. The range of ingredients available changed dramatically, and the sort of social meaning of food changes very much insofar as, well, let me give you an example. Sugar, when it starts out, it was considered a miracle food. I mean, because it
Mm,
was categorized in humoral physiology as being hot and moist because of the sweetness. It was
mhm,
considered very, very nourishing. And so it was recommended by physicians to throw on everything, and cookbooks did put it on everything. And that's not to say that our, modern cuisine isn't very heavily sugar laden. It is actually, but not in ways that they did in the past. They would have thrown it on pasta or thrown it on a chicken, or sugar on pretty much everything as a universal condiment. So, and of course, it changes socially, meaning that when it starts, it's a very rare item, expensive, imported, and when it eventually is grown with slave labor in the Caribbean and in the Americas, it comes in much greater volume and goes into junk food after that, and goes into every cup of tea and coffee, and so the meaning and the use changes, even though it seems to be the same ingredient. Historically, it's very different, and obviously, historically, it influences much bigger movements in history that we think happened for who knows what reason, but they often happen for very simple commodities like sugar, and the connection of sugar and slavery is explicit.
okay, so you've talked about sugar and cinnamon being sprinkled on everything at certain points in the during your lectures. Um, Aside from doctors prescribing sugar, why was sugar and cinnamon used so often previously?
Well, it's a status symbol, quite pretty simply. If you don't have a whole lot of luxury items to buy, fancy cars and so on, um, you want to show off your wealth in other ways, and actually consuming it is, I think, one of the most powerful ways because it's gone once you eat it.
Mm.
Um, so, things that are rare and expensive, if you're throwing a banquet, you want to impress. It's a kind of power play, really, that you buy the most expensive rarities that you can and serve them, and people are very impressed, and they in fact imitate what you do, and that's the way the sort of fashion trickles down to other people.
Okay, so some of the earliest civilizations, though, how did they eat?
Well, it really depends on where you are. We have a sense of um, that what people ate in the past was very simple, and bare bones. Cooking methods were simple, and nothing could be further from the truth. I think once settled societies emerge after the Neolithic Revolution, 10,000 BC or so, um, there are very, very complicated methods of cooking. And in fact, there's even some cookbooks that go back not quite that far, but there's an Akkadian cookbook that's about 1500 BC that
Wow.
not very well translated. Really, complicated, sophisticated cuisine with dozens of recipes. And even when you don't have a cookbook per se, if you say look at archaeological evidence from, say, the Olmec culture in Mesoamerica, or you look at the Zhou dynasty in China. There's things that will tell you exactly what's going on culinarily, and sometimes very literally so, as they'll take residues off the rims of pots and things and figure out that there was dairy in there, or they were cooking meat, whatever it may be. So sometimes a recipe can actually be reconstructed. Interestingly.
Well, that's something that I found interesting is in on your blog, but and also in the accompanying PDF with the Audible series that I read. You have many recipes that are significantly old. In fact, I believe you referenced one of making, is it bread with acorn flour?
Yeah, well, that's a technique that comes from right where I am now in California. Um, and it's sort of very counterintuitive, which I love about it, is they didn't have ceramics. So they would make pots out of baskets, very, very tightly woven, and they swell and they become waterproof. And then you fill that with water, and then you heat up rocks. You put the rocks into the basket, add the ground acorn flour that's been leached of its tannins, and you get a kind of porridge. And then that porridge can be taken out, flapped onto a hot rock, and it becomes a kind of chip. So it's a sort of bread if you want. And I think there are ingredients like that that are very nutritious. They're very, you don't have to grow them, because in fact the oak trees are everywhere. I could probably point one out
Look at
if I
that. Yeah.
looked closely enough while I'm walking. And so, people wonder, well, why didn't the Yokuts and Miwok, the people who were right here in Stockton, California, where I am, and people wonder, well, why didn't they develop agriculture? Did they just not have the technology, or were they, not advanced enough? And it's exactly the opposite. They had so much food here. The population was so booming, because that ironically, the more you go into agriculture, and the more people starve. Whereas if you're depending on nature, easily, when people are living in proximity, one anthropologist figured out they actually even had more free time to do what they wanted, which is kind of amazing. So, civilization comes with a great price. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, so it's interesting, and I think I lost you a little bit there as you walked through a certain area. But to recap, so we used to, I think originally we thought that some of our prehistoric ancestors that they were not well fed, but the reality is that it was the opposite of that. That they didn't need to produce agriculture because they were great, as you call them, gatherers and hunters rather than hunter gatherers. Um, why do you talk about gathering and hunting rather than hunting and gathering for some of our early ancestors?
Well, it's really a matter of just calories. How many calories come from plant food and are picked regularly, seasonally, by the entire group, really. Hunting is more of a special occasion thing, and it depends on, we when we picture hunting, we think of sort of large game animals and
Hmm.
intrepid hunters with bows and arrows or spears and things. But in general, it's really much smaller. Mice and rats and smaller mammals that are more typical. And but they form much smaller part of the diet, really, in terms of food. And of course that depends on the place where you are on the earth. In some places they will depend more on seafood, in some places they'll depend more on fruits from trees if you're in the tropics. And so I think that it's kind of we tend to think, oh, here is what the Neolithic diet was, or the hunting and gathering diet was like, and this is how humans were supposed to eat, hence the Paleolithic diet before
Hmm.
the Neolithic. And their assumption is that it was all meat and there was no starches, and therefore we should eat bacon and not eat white bread, which makes really no sense, because it is it depends on where you are on earth, but also they definitely gathered grains and definitely made something like a bread long, long before there's agriculture. Um, and a significant part of the diet was starchy tubers and grains and fruits that were starchy. So it's not it's a kind of misconception that our ancestors ate meat, and look, we have canine teeth, and therefore we should be chomping on meat primarily. We're not designed as carnivores, unlike cats, say, which really can only eat meat. We're omnivores, and in fact, we need a full range of foods from many different groups in order to be well fed, and we need fat. And so cutting out fat from your diet is just as bizarre and unsensible as cutting out grains, really.
Yeah, I've been in the health and fitness business for the better part of about 25 years, and I think one of the things that fascinates me is whatever new movement, and I call them religions, relative to how people eat.
They are.
I mean,
Yeah.
it is dogmatic to the nth degree.
Well, it's not only
Whether
a matter of being dogmatic, it's a matter of a conversion experience and
yes, yes,
sticking faithfully to it and having fellow people in the group that you can identify with.
right,
And people say that it's transformative, and what these diets promise is very, very much like religion. It promises that you'll be happy and healthy and your love life will improve and everything will get better. And of course, that's not the case. They're usually designed to make you lose weight very quickly,
right,
and then
right.
you put it back, slowly. But it's that's a phenomenon that I think we tend to think is a very modern thing. We tend to think, well, this comes along with advertising and the modern marketplace for fad diets. But it goes back thousands of years, actually. Dieting, not for the weight loss, but dieting as a religion, as you put it very well, is a very, very ancient thing.
Well, I thought it was fascinating that at a certain point in history, you talk about how priests came along to really legitimate a ruler, and really to create rituals to both appease God, but also to appease the priestly class. Rulers would bring priests in to say, "I am now a legitimate ruler," and then the priestly class would put into the state what people should be eating. How has religion itself affected the way we eat throughout history?
Well, if you look at every organized religion, it will have dietary codes. And I think it is primarily because when people have a common activity that they're doing together, and especially one that demands either a sacrifice or that demands that you feast, and revel, that those two things kind of act as social cement for the community. They bind people together in a way that if everyone is just eating on their own, or even just eating in their own families, you kind of don't get a sense of group identity and group distinctiveness from other people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think food is the easiest way to do that, because we connect with food more than probably anything, because we all have to do it all the time. So when you give it up, it is a communal activity. When you feast with other people, it is a ritual that you repeat, and of course you see the same people there. You reignite relationships. You forge that identity by explaining who's in and who's out, and why we're this way because we don't eat pork, or we don't eat until sundown on Ramadan, or we don't eat cows because they're the highest form of reincarnated being.
Mm.
So I think religion probably expresses itself best through food, actually, and of course through rituals, weekly or daily rituals. But food is includes everyone, so I think that's why it's much stronger. And you could include clothes in that. You could include
Sure.
dancing
Yeah.
rituals. You could include things that every person does. But I think food is more powerful in that sense.
I found it fascinating when you discussed the idea that what the what the social classes would eat would be different relative to what the priestly class told them to eat. And often it came back to, what did the priests want to eat relative to what were they telling the other classes to eat? Can you talk a little bit more about how that changed depending on who was in power?
Well, let me give you a random example, which I'm not sure this speaks to exactly what you're talking about, but if you talk about the ancient Brahmin class in Hinduism, they were invaders who came into India and ate cattle and sacrificed cows and horses. And what the speculation is that, how did these people go from cow a cattle rearing and consuming culture into one that reveres cows and considers them a reincarnated form. One theory is that there was a terrible famine, and this priestly class was threatened to lose their status because, of course, they were eating a much richer diet than the vast majority of people. They were eating a lot of meat. People wanted that. And in order to hold on to their position, they said, we're not eating meat anymore. And we're going to have a much more austere diet to prove our distinctiveness. And in Hindu society, there were castes, meaning that when you were born into a caste, you could only eat people of that same caste. You couldn't be served by someone below you. And that kept these social classes not just rigid, but permanent. You couldn't, you can go down, but you can't move up in
Yeah.
caste. So that if you're a Brahmin priest or you're a warrior or if you're a merchant or you're whatever, they're very, very strictly formed into a hierarchy and explicit rules about what you can and can't eat, and who you can eat with maintain that distinction. And the theory goes, at least, that this is how the Brahmins kept their power, by reducing their diet, which is actually very, very different from most societies where the elites flaunt their wealth and really want to point out those distinctions by serving rare things and extravagant things and having complicated recipes. But the difference is that in those kind of societies, I'm thinking maybe ancient Rome or medieval Europe or even Aztec Mexico, there is room for social mobility. So people can actually rise up through wealth or through fighting in a battle. You can be ennobled. Those are open elites, meaning that people can have access to them. They can imitate what their superiors are doing. And what that does is it makes it a very fluid, evolving cuisine. Because anytime you have something that's really distinctive and the people below you are imitating you, you're going to say, oh, this is no longer so special. I need to reinvent something else, which means something more rare, more expensive, more complicated to make. You start hiring professional chefs and publishing your work so everyone knows exactly what you're doing. And I think that's the sort of driver of fashion in the culinary arts. But in some societies where there is no social mobility, the food changes much more slowly. China is maybe a good example of that. Not that their elite classes revere antiquity, revere ancestors, and revere the classic way dishes are made. Not that there aren't new dishes, and obviously in the modern era, many, many new ones, but that's a cuisine that has, or cuisines, I should say, many cuisines that have withstood time and changed comparatively little.
Interesting. And one of the things I found fascinating, and I recently watched Stanley Tucci's show Searching for Italy, and it was fascinating to hear about how pizza and standard fare like that has become a daily life for people in Italy, but also how certain foods that were part of, let's say, the working class or the common folk were now elevated. Lobster was not considered something that was luxurious and indulgent. It was actually the thing that people would eat if you were part of the working class. And so there's been an upward and a downward mobility. Can you talk about how those shifts in the culture have influenced how we eat?
Yeah, it's a little more complicated than that. I think there definitely is two-way movement. And sometimes if the cuisine becomes so elaborate and so extravagant, sometimes serving something simple is a kind of super sophistication, saying that, well, you've actually, overwrought that dish and there's too many spices and too many flavors going on. But if I serve you, this absolutely perfect carrot or this thing that I grew in my backyard, which is organic and sustainable and
Dan
has all these other
Barber,
values
Blue Hill.
added.
Yeah.
Exactly that. And
Yeah.
all these other values added to it, then that is a kind of hyper sophistication. So sometimes returning to simple food, and in fact even peasant food, is a value. But let me correct this notion that lobster was not considered elegant.
Okay.
That's a real misconception, and it comes from records that of New England in the 19th century when they fed lobster to prisoners because it was cheap and it was everywhere. And that paper was actually written by a colleague of mine, a former colleague of mine, George Lewis, in the history department, right, pointing in that direction a block or two. Um, and it does work for the 19th century. But if you go back to Europe in the centuries preceding, take a look at any still life painting, Dutch still life painting.
Oh,
They
that's a
are
good point.
lobsters are presented on the table
I've
as the
never
most
thought about that.
extravagant, resplendent, beautiful food. So
It's part of the
Europeans
cornucopia.
definitely,
Yeah.
yeah, loved lobster.
Oh, interesting.
And
Okay.
there are exquisite recipes for it from the early modern period all the way up through the present. Um, I think the denigration of lobster is really just a weird New England thing that happens because it's so ubiquitous there, and more as it becomes a business, obviously to sell, and their markets expand, and then lobster gains its status back again.
Okay, so that's a really interesting point that maybe during that period of time there was a different perspective on lobster. I think oftentimes we tend to think whatever we see from our current point of view or from a snapshot of time is can then be extrapolated out as well. It's
Right,
always
right,
been that way. The
right.
last, I would say, 5 years, fasting has become very en vogue. And yet, you've done significant amount of research on how fasting has been utilized throughout history. What have you found relative to fasting?
Well, fasting occurs all over the place, primarily connected with religion, as I was saying before. It's a I mean, I can speak in detail about the Judeo-Christian tradition. It was an act of penitence. So if
Mm,
you've done something really terrible, you basically stop eating and put ashes on your forehead and wear sackcloth and say, God, I'm really sorry. I won't do this again. Don't smite me.
mhm.
And I promise, not to do this. So it was considered a kind of self-punishment, but also something that would make your spirit stronger, which is
Right.
why this fasting regulations. But the that kind of a special day in fasting, obviously, Yom Kippur in Judaism, and fasting for emergent occasions before war, before making that doesn't sound like a good idea actually, but it's before important decisions, and people, the whole community would do a public fast in order
Right.
to get on God's good side, basically. Um, and then there were fasts people did as purging, cleansing activities, including Jesus as a good Jew. He did it,
Mm,
as did the apostles. And was what happened was that Christianity made a conscious effort to distance itself from Judaism when it became a separate religion, really under the influence of Paul,
mm.
who said this is universal, it's for everyone, it's not just a religion for Jews. And they dropped circumcision, they dropped all the kosher laws, they dropped many, and that particular fasting day, but they didn't drop the fast as penitence because Jesus did it. So they must make sense. But eventually, when they started coming up with fasting regulations in the in late antiquity, really, and authors wrote about this. Saint Jerome wrote about it. Saint Basil, Saint Chrysostom. They were working in the mindset of a really late antique humoral physiology that comes from Hippocrates and Galen. And in their minds, foods that are very, very nourishing, meaning meat primarily, it's the thing that most easily transforms into our flesh, it's most easily assimilated into us. Um, those are things which will not only restore the muscle tissue in your bodies and add fat to you if you don't get exercise, but they will also generate sperm in both men and women, which I know sounds totally random and bizarre, but they believe women had produce sperm also. And when that happens,
Interesting.
it signals your libido. And when that happens, you are more inclined to sin. So in that season of penitence during Lent, the logic is don't eat meat or dairy products or cheese or eggs because those are the most nutritious things and those are going to stimulate your libido and lead you to sin, which is going to be disastrous. But vegetables are fine. Those are not nutritious. Fish are fine because those are cold and moist and not likely to make you horny. And so their logic really doesn't it doesn't make sense to us anymore since that whole system of humoral physiology kind of decays by the 17th century and is replaced by other systems and obviously eventually is replaced by modern nutrition. But what amazes me is that it took until really 1964, Vatican II, for the Catholic Church to finally say, well, maybe you don't really have to give up meat. That's not going to make, cause problems. Give up something else that's very important to you. But many other Christian sects, Eastern Orthodox churches, still do fasts, very, very extensive throughout the calendar year. And lots of people still eat fish on Friday for, traditional reasons.
So
But
it's
it's,
interesting that you talk about the sexual nature of it, because I found that fascinating as I've studied food and food relative to religion and religious constructs and the codes that they put out. I found it fascinating that many religions still have a tradition to reduce meat or to go away from meat. In fact, Seventh Day Adventists
yeah,
promote a very plant-based diet because historically, if the story is correct, they believed that the consumption of meat that the founder of the Seventh Day Adventist Church observed from her perspective that it led to increased masturbation in boys that were in a sanitarium. And so then the revelation came to say, well, if you get rid of meat and you only eat plant and you eat things from the earth, then Jesus will come back sooner. Many other religions still have codes of health that encourage more of a grain-based or a plant-based diet. The Mormon Church encourages people to eat less meat and more grains. What? Why do some of these things still persist, given that we know more about food and nutrition through science?
well, vegetarianism has been appealing to many religions. The assumption, not just in these Christian sects, but also in among Hindus, is that meat eating uh, demands that you kill an animal, a
Mm.
sentient being, who in some cases is reincarnated. Could be your Aunt Tilly, who you're eating, um, and that makes you insensitive to the act of killing and makes you more violent in general. Now, we all know there are many examples of vegetarians who are, just as healthy, just as violent, just as Hitler's maybe a good example. He's
Mm.
mostly a vegetarian, and and I think that the why these things persist is that diets of any kind, especially when you can do something easily like cut out meat, makes you distinctive, makes you separate from other people, and makes you feel more happy about yourself, right? And when it's
Yeah,
when it's put into
interesting.
a code or a religion, it's empowering. It gives you power over your body. And I think even when people, I mean, there's a string of books and theories that argue that when people um, go through extreme fasting or taking out various parts of their diet, they tend to be people who don't feel like they have a lot of control in many parts of their lives, and that dieting or removing things that they consider to be unclean, this is, the whole cleansing idea is a
Right.
psychological one, that gives them power over something, which is their own body. And you could say that this is the logic behind the extreme ascetic movements within Christianity and well, any religion really, is that this is a way for someone who has very little power to kind of assert themselves, their control over their body, and then feel good and think, well, I'm righteous. I'm going to go to heaven. You people who are eating meat and engaging in sex and doing all these bad things, you're not. And
Mhm.
when the time comes, we're going to be looking over the edge of the clouds down at you laughing because we're righteous. So it's a I hesitate to bring Friedrich Nietzsche into the whole thing because he's a very difficult figure in many ways.
Right.
But he claimed this was he called it the slave morality. He said that it is always disempowered people who create these very elaborate strictures on and define morality in a way that this is a kind of revenge against their oppressors. And of course, Christianity and Judaism are at root, basically, oppressed people who this is the way that they will get back at their Roman oppressors or whoever it may be.
Yeah, fascinating. So speaking of government and shifting from religion to government, how has government shaped the way we eat?
Oh, what a huge question. Well, let's use our own government as an example. We have had many initiatives, I think most bravely by Michelle Obama, who decided that she was going to help people eat better, move more, give up junk food, give up all sorts of things that obviously are not, we know that they're not very good for health. That's the right hand. The left hand is providing subsidies for corn, which goes into high fructose corn syrup, which goes into junk food. So the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing, or they're
Mhm.
certainly at odds. And that's because, of course, we have different constituencies in the country, and we have, states that will support the farm bill because the farmers are the ones who can pay the lobbyists and pay for people's campaigns. And so the government has an enormous impact upon what we eat or don't eat. And I think in the United States in particular, we don't really want the government telling us what to eat and what not to. We say we're free people. If I want to eat sugary soda that has 12 tablespoons of sugar in it, I'm going to do it because it's my body and I can do what I want. Critics say, well, but then you are actually paying, you're actually, you know, becoming a burden on the healthcare system because the health costs that are going to accrue as you get older and sicker are actually being borne by the whole country in the burden of healthcare, which is a huge, huge proportion of our, expenditure. The part that comes out of everyone's check, if you're
Right.
working, is enormous, and so it isn't really a private matter. And if we lived in a so-called nanny state where the government could say, "I think this is a really bad idea," and it's banned, most people who really, really wanted it would figure out a way to get it on the black market anyway. But I think in general, it would you'd see positive results. Let me give you an extreme example, which maybe soft drinks are seem a little bit benign in comparison, but let's take smoking, right? I mean, if I were an enlightened dictator, I could say I ban cigarettes right now because I know my country, every single person will be healthier and happier without them. And if you're an addict, we're going to make it really, really hard for you to get. And of course, some people will figure out a way to do it, but in general, younger people will not as much. And so we obviously don't want to take that tack because we don't live in an autocratic state. And I think the health warnings have done us good to a certain extent. And in as generations in passing generations, people do smoke less and less, but we still are. There's still a lot of it in our society, and often the people who can afford it least. So I don't know whether you remember, Obama put a tax on it,
Right.
so that essentially cigarettes cost twice as much as they would otherwise, which means that those people are actually not buying as much food as they would.
Yeah.
They're buying,
Interesting.
that. So I think that there are always many sides to these issues, and I think that they don't always have the intended outcome.
But I'm talking about the impact that, let's say, being overweight, obese, and many of the hypokinetic diseases are causing on the healthcare system. Recently, the Lancet reported that over 1 billion people suffer from malnutrition via obesity rather than underfeeding. And I believe the statistic was almost a 2 to 1. About 500 million people suffer from malnutrition due to underfeeding, and over 1 billion now are from obesity. And the way that they posed this in the report was that we are being overfed and undernourished. Um,
Yeah.
has there been any other time in our history where we have been overfed and undernourished?
No, this is a complete anomaly in human history. Apart from maybe a few individuals who could indulge themselves, and you know, um, people have pointed to Henry VIII as an example, or
Yeah. Okay.
or people in ancient Egypt who definitely had gout and things that were, brought on by their poor diet. So individuals could, but a mass of people in society, absolutely not. And when we look to the cause of this, I think it's really unfair to blame individuals, saying, "Oh, you're irresponsible," or "It's
Sure.
your fault. You're fat, and so why don't you just go and do something about it?" When in fact, access to food is very unequal. Fruits and vegetables cost a lot of money; they're not subsidized.
Hmm.
The stuff we want people to eat actually costs more than eating junk food or fast food.
Right.
And I think until we, make a conscious effort for those foods to be better for you, um, then this is going to continue to be a problem. And it's going to continue to get worse because the people who are making these foods, know that the more food they get into you, the more money they make, the more their shareholders are happy, and the more profit, more they'll succeed as a business. And as much as we hate that S word, socialism, because it sounds like it's communist, sounds like something terrible. I think that sometimes states can make very good decisions for the general public that are in the interest. Health is a no-brainer. I mean, that's kind of that. It goes without saying that the state should do that, and we clearly, as a people, don't really care. I mean, that's what it comes down to, where we think everyone should be able to do whatever they want, eat whatever they want, and the consequences are, don't matter. That's what we're saying. And
Choice
um,
without accountability, choice without consequence, in essence.
right,
Yeah.
right.
Which doesn't exist.
Right, and on the other hand, let me play the devil's advocate from another perspective. There are obviously many people for whom they are naturally bigger people. They're born
Hmm.
that way, and I
Right.
think to make a clinical description of obesity, and this is something I've actually written about. That doesn't exist historically until about the 18th century. A whole handful of German dissertations come out that start to define obesity as a pathology, which it isn't before. It was just a kind of body type in ancient medicine. Um, but when we start doing that, we inadvertently place blame, and we inadvertently cause guilt, on those people. And ultimately, what it looks like everyone is saying is, if you're overweight or obese, this is your fault, and you suffer the consequences because you have free choice. And if you don't make the right decisions, don't blame us. We're just providing the stuff. When in fact, I don't know, I'm divided. I mean, obviously that has terrible consequences for people like that socially and culturally. In a society where we are obsessed with thinness, we don't really think that you can be very unhealthy in a thin body, right? I mean, you can be, we tend to say, "Oh, athletics is really good. It's so good for your body. It's so healthy." Look at how many injuries and things. Is it really good for health if you're always breaking something, or
Right.
cause
Right.
long-term damage to your body from overworking one particular muscle, whatever it may be? I think we don't have a good perspective on how to evaluate these things because we adore thinness and we equate that with beauty, when in fact it's a mistake, I think. And we equate it with health, which is also a mistake. There are people who are large who will live long and happy lives. And this is the other thing, because I actually teach a history of medicine class also, which I'm going to go to right after this. Um, and I think that if you look at what a culture values, ultimately, it will determine what the medical system looks like and the
Mm.
recommendations that are given. So I think in our system, although we don't formally recognize it, we culturally value uh, slimness, and that is built into our dietary recommendation.
Hmm.
Value longevity, and we're willing to keep someone alive even though the end of their life is perfectly miserable. We are very squeamish about euthanasia. But in general, when you look at these recommendations that come out of the American Heart Association and various other constituencies, they're designed not to make people happy. They're designed to make people live longer.
Mm.
And I think that maybe we could think, is is the is obesity such an incredible people are calling it an epidemic.
Hmm.
And it's obviously not an infectious disease, so,
Right.
but
Right.
it's a cultural phenomenon. But is it really terrible? That's what I'm coming down to. I mean, I understand in our social context, in our society, we look down upon it, but should we? Maybe we're all wrong about that. You know, maybe when people are very thin, they fall victim to diseases much easier because they're not well nourished. And maybe when people have a little meat on them, they are, they have more robust bodies, and that's just not considered really in the medical landscape.
Yeah, it seems like that's an interesting perspective. And it seems like in our society, we take a very strong binary. We're either far on one side or we're far on the other side. And given the fact that we've never seen this level of obesity and this level of what we would consider or classify people being overweight, especially at the magnitude that we have, and also just the size of individuals, um, it's new territory for us. I find it fascinating to look at how diverse we are and what those extremes look
Yeah,
like.
yeah. Well, totally, and I think it's also a mistake to say that there weren't large people in the past,
Oh,
and
sure. Right.
sometimes very valued as beauty. I mean, look at Rubens. His favorite
Mm-hmm.
bodies were large, and in some cultures, having a lot of fat on you is considered a sign of good, breeding possibility. And so,
Right.
obviously that's entirely socially conditioned. We tend to think in absolute medical terms because we're looking at life expectancy and incidence of heart disease and all sorts of other indicators, which are random. There could be totally different indicators, and maybe a life very well led, even if it cuts a few years off your life, is better than one where you end up in a hospital hooked up to machines and being poked and prodded. I don't
Yeah.
know. I mean, I don't have an answer for that. But I
Well,
think it's a
that
good
seems to be the
perspective to
question
think.
of our day. Yeah, that really seems to be the
Yeah,
question of our day is what is the quality of life that we're looking for? Ken, I want to shift gears just a little bit. It's clear from your lectures and writing that food and the intake of food throughout history appears to have been a thoughtful process. Everything from the choice of food to the arrangement of seating has been well thought out. Given that many Americans report that they eat fast food and or eat convenience food as meals on a regular basis, we've gotten away from food preparation. Uh, Does that concern you at all?
well, it's been one of my arguing points for some time that um, cooking is an essential human activity
Mhm.
that ought to give people pleasure, that ought to afford them an opportunity to share with other people and provide sustenance for them, and that there's fundamentally something about human happiness that derives from cooking, knowing what's going into your food, and knowing what you like actually, and serving yourself and not being beholden to someone else to provide it for you. I've had people argue, well, I don't like cooking,
Mhm.
and I'm entitled to not find that interesting. And I said, well, yeah, of course. There are things that I can't do. I don't like math. I don't like most play. I don't mind playing sports. I hate watching them. But to each their own. But I thought that actually these things are fundamentally important. Things like dancing and singing and um, playing competitive sport, playing them, not watching them, are fundamental. And I think it's kind of, I mean, if you think about it, let me linger on this subject of watching instead of doing. We tend to watch people
Yeah, we're
cook
a
on TV as
voyeuristic
entertainment
society. Yeah,
rather than do it. We tend to watch sports on TV rather than do it.
right.
You could argue pornography provides the same thing for people who
Right.
aren't
Yeah, good
having
point.
sex. And so in a sense, I think that doing these things yourself um, gives you a form of creative expression, not following a recipe, actually just diving in and doing it, and that's a fundamental part of human nature. I think making things by hand is also fundamentally rewarding, and especially when you share them. I mean, let me give you a weird anecdote. As I
Like spoons, right?
Yeah, well, that's exactly it. I have started carving, and it's sort of part of what I do food wise, because obviously you eat with them. But I think the nicest
They're
thing about
beautiful,
this
by the
is,
way. I at
thank you.
least the pictures you put up on your blog, they're beautiful spoons.
I just had a show that closed this past week, which was totally random. I didn't plan it. Someone just came up to me and said, "Can we do a show based on these?" And I'm like, "Yes." But the nicest
Love
thing
that.
is giving them away and seeing them in other people's houses and people using them. That I would say, like cooking, it's the social act that is
Mm.
rewarding, prime, precisely because it's not a monetary transaction. People say, "Oh, can I buy one of these?" And I'm like, "Nope, I'm my good friend. I'll give you one." you know, that's really what I want. I don't need, I'm not good. I don't really need to make a profit from it. So I can make whatever I want. I can do whatever. I don't have to judge what's the market gonna purchase this week. And that's the nature of capitalism, of course. But yes, it is fun. Totally a ball.
Well, and you've really gotten into making some interesting food. I mean, you make unique foods from macaroon tartare or a takoyaki, or correct me if I'm saying this one incorrectly, ildi with almond butter and persimmon chutney.
Idli, which
Idli.
is Southern Indian. Yeah. So I like to play in the kitchen, and I like to mash up different cuisines and ingredients that don't belong together. And it's really just a form of recreation for me and play. I did the last cookbook I did was on gelatin, and I swear it was a dare. It was someone dared me to look at a
Okay, so
Facebook group called
so on that,
called
what is bullshot jello?
yeah. So a bullshot is a cocktail made with beef broth and vodka, and it's really very
Okay.
good. It sounds it
Okay.
sounds bizarre, but I figured let me turn this into a jello and let me serve it inside a bone that where the marrow came out of, and serve it with crackers that are made with the bone marrow as the fat, as sort of a shortbread. And it was just so much fun to do because it's not you would never see anything, you'd never see jello in that form, you'd never see bone marrow in that form. So it was just kind of my playing with food. And gelatin, I have to admit, I don't really like gelatin. It was just one of those things that someone dared me to do, and I'm like, okay, I'll give this a shot. Let's see what happens. And it's really a fun material to work with.
Yeah, that's funny. The picture when you talk about it being fun, it was fun to look at. Bullshot jello, marrow bone shortbread, and pickled lemon. I thought, what a really cool thing. Now, my experience is that many people are intimidated by going into the kitchen and starting to cook if they haven't done it, let alone exploring and creating and playing with the food. What advice would you give someone who has not been in the kitchen cooking their own food? They've been eating out, they've been eating fast food, they've been eating simple grab and goes.
Okay,
How do they get started?
well, here's my advice. And I am doing it right now in a class that I'm teaching called Historical Imagination. And I had this revelation, actually from carving spoons, that ultimately led me to read this book that was about a pottery class. I'm also a potter, oddly enough. But it's
Oh, interesting. Okay.
what happened is in a class, the instructor said, "I am going to give you an assignment. Half of you, I'm going to give you a grade based on the weight of what you throw. So if you throw 1,000 pots, you get an A. If you throw 900, you get a B. Whatever, just throw as much as you can. The other half, I want you to make the best pot you can, and I will judge you on that and give you an appropriate grade on how good you turn out." And the result of this was that the people who were being graded by weight did really, really beautiful things because they did it over and over, and they practiced and they practiced, and they came out with magnificent things. The other half, the people were so overthinking it, and they were trying too hard, and they said, "Oh, we only have one shot, so it's got to be the best pot." And of course, their things came out terrible because they weren't actually throwing that much. So
Mm.
the lesson to be learned here is you just have to keep doing it over and over again. For my class, it's writing. We write every day, as much as we possibly can. And um, I found for carving wood, there was no way I was going to master the cuts and the way the thing is held if I just said, "Oh, I'll throw it to do with them." Obviously, I'll give them away, but it's I think practice, like playing the guitar, doing anything, is you cannot get good unless you do it over and over again. And eventually develop skills. So it becomes second nature. So you don't even think about it. So in the kitchen, if you start with slicing and browning an onion,
Mm,
which you can read 1,000 directions from a cookbook and do it, and it will still be terrible because you're just following the instructions and not
right,
internalizing it. If
right,
you cut 1,000 onions or do it every single day, eventually you will get very good with the knife. You'll be able to judge how far the heat goes up, how much fat to use, how to brown it without burning it. That only comes from actually doing it. And I think that is true of pretty much anything in life. Any skill you're trying to master or get halfway decent at demands just do it over and over again. Keep doing it. So for beginners in the kitchen, just get in the kitchen, start with the simplest stuff, and don't look at a cookbook. I know that's terrible advice for someone who writes cookbooks, but it's they can be debilitating because it's kind of like the metaphor I like to think of is if you were learning to drive and get around a city and you always use a GPS device, you will never learn your way around the city, you know.
that's
And
true.
the minute
That is true.
your GPS device goes off or there's a detour, you're lost.
Right.
If you wander around the city a lot, as you can see I'm doing in soccer, you'll know every single nook and cranny. You'll know how to get around, regardless of where you are. Um, and cooking is the same way. You know, don't depend on that you know, hand holding. You know, just and I when I learned to cook, I did not plan this consciously. I was in college and I had a roommate who said, "I'll do all the dishes and if you do all the cooking," and I'm like, "Yep, I'm in." I didn't think about whether I could do it or not. I just did it. I just started and made mistakes, obviously, and some things can turn out terrible. But that's the way you learn.
It seems that it's not when within the family life, it's not just about the cooking, but it's about the ritual of dining together. And you've talked and written about the demise of both home cooking and the family meal. Um, so, firstly, what has caused home cooking and the family meal to go by the wayside?
A lot of it is convenience food. A lot of it, obviously, the appeal of that was because people were working late and commuting and didn't have as much time to play around in the kitchen, and I totally understand that. The industry exploited that, but they also convinced people that they couldn't do those things, so that
The
if you
learned
tell your average
helplessness.
person, well, it's intentional intentional de-skilling.
Mm,
If you convince someone that stock is a really hard thing to make, you can't do that. And in fact, it's a really simple thing to make. You throw everything in a pot and then you strain it.
yeah.
It takes time, but no real skill to make an ordinary stock. But people will say, "Oh, this is so much more convenient. I'll buy this stuff in a can." And the stuff in a can or a concentrate or a cube or whatever form it comes in is so souped up in flavor that your taste buds kind of get addicted to that extra whatever it is,
Yeah.
even if it's not MSG, it's hydrolyzed vegetable protein or something else. That tasting an ordinary stock just kind of tastes a little wan and flat, and
Mm.
it's because you don't have all those flavors and fragrances in your arsenal of cooking. So I think they have a gastronomic effect that goes beyond just people not knowing how to do stuff and depending on convenience or to go or taking out or delivery, whatever it may be. Is that the sophistication of the flavor industry and convenience foods and whatever and fast food whatever is actually makes us taste less.
Right.
It cuts down on our ability to perceive pure flavors. I mean, do this experiment: eat a Dorito and then go taste a carrot, see if you can taste anything there. And you can't really.
Yeah. I joke with my clients that oftentimes I say the foods that you will go buy that are convenience foods, or if you're buying fast foods, they're almost pornographic in nature. You become desensitized to what real food tastes like because of how food scientists have tried to pack so much flavor into the convenience food. I'm curious
That's exactly it.
what have you found relative to the social and health ramifications of the demise of the family meal?
Well, obviously, it's valuable to meet as a family at one time a day and talk about your day and discuss things. And it's kind of socializing, teaching young people how to compromise and how to get along with others and have differing opinions. And and that's a good thing. I think there's an argument that it prepares us for civilized politics, and
Mm.
that the reason that our political system has gone into such a bizarre spectrum, bizarre polarization, is that we've stopped being civil and eating
Yes.
at the table and learning, good manners and how to address people and how not to. And I think that's kind of true in particular people's cases. But I think also just if you're not meeting around food, when are you meeting, if at all? That's the thing.
Yeah.
The little bugs here.
You got a bug friend flying around with
Yep.
you.
Yep. There you go. So I hate to say this, but I actually have a meeting right now at 10 o'clock. And
All right.
there's the bell. You can hear it.
Well, Ken,
And I have to
it's
be
been
in my dean's office.
yeah, it's been a fascinating conversation. I want to thank you for coming on. If people want to learn more about you, where's the best place for people to follow?
Oh gosh, just Google my name, Ken Albala, and
All right. Well, we'll have that in the show notes. And Ken, thank you once again for coming on and sharing your wisdom with our listeners.
thank you so much for having me. It's been a delight.
All right. Have a great day.
Take care.
Thanks for joining me today for this episode of The Evolved Man. If you're learning from and gaining value from this podcast, please subscribe to the Evolved Man newsletter, where I can support you even more in your personal evolution. I want to help you reverse engineer your success. The Evolved Man newsletter is like getting a free coaching session to keep you moving forward on your path of personal success. Go to theevolvedmanpodcast.com to sign up today. If you found value in this episode, you can give us up to a 5-star rating on Apple and Spotify and share it with your network. That's the best way to support the podcast so we can continue to get great guests and provide you with the best wisdom for your daily life. Until next time, keep evolving.